The wind had lost its sting, all the smells of the city were coming back, and the markets were full of flowers. I dashed to Roger's house without even thinking of what I was doing, and demanded that he tell me where Nicolas lived. I would just have a look at him, make certain he was in good health, be certain the house was fine enough. It was on the Ile Saint-Louis, and very impressive, just as I'd wanted, but the windows were all shuttered along the quay. I stood watching it for a long time as one carriage after another roared over the nearby bridge, and I knew that I had to see Nicky. I started to climb the wall just as I had climbed walls in the village, and I found it amazingly easy. One story after another I climbed, much higher than I had ever dared to climb in the past. And then I sped over the roof and down the inside of the courtyard to look for Nicky's flat. I passed a handful of open windows before I came to the right one, and then there was Nicolas in the glare of the supper table, and Jeannette and Luchina were with him, and they were having the late-night meal that we used to take together when the theater closed. At the first sight of him I drew back away from the casement and closed my eyes. I might have fallen if my right hand hadn't held fast to the wall, as if with a will of its own. I had seen the room for only an instant, but every detail was fixed in my mind. He was dressed in old green velvet finery he'd worn so casually in the crooked streets at home, but everywhere around him were signs of the wealth I'd sent him. Leather-bound books on the shelves, and an inlaid desk with an oval painting above it, and the Italian violin gleaming atop the new pianoforte. He wore a jeweled ring I'd sent, and his brown hair was tied back with a black silk ribbon, and he sat brooding with his elbows on the table, eating nothing from the expensive china plate before him. Carefully I opened my eyes and looked at him again. All his natural gifts were there in a blaze of light. The delicate but strong limbs, large sober brown eyes, and his mouth, that for all the irony and sarcasm that could come out of it was childlike and ready to be kissed. There seemed in him a frailty I'd never perceived or understood. Yet he looked infinitely intelligent, my Nicky, full of tangled, uncompromising thoughts, as he listened to Jeannette, who was talking rapidly. "Lestat's married," she said as Luchina nodded. "The wife's rich, and he can't let her know he was a common actor. It's simple enough." "I say we let him in peace," Luchina said. "He saved the theater from closing, and he showers us with gifts." "I don't believe it," Nicolas said bitterly. "He wouldn't be ashamed of us." There was a suppressed rage in his voice, an ugly grief. "And why did he leave the way he did? I heard him calling me. The window was smashed to pieces. I tell you I was half awake, and I heard his voice." An uneasy silence fell among them. They didn't believe his account of things. How I'd vanished from the garret, and telling it again would only isolate him and embitter him further. I could sense this from all their thoughts. "You didn't really know Lestat," he said now, almost in a surly fashion, returning to the manageable conversation that other mortals would allow him. "Lestat would spit in the face of anyone who would be ashamed of us. He sends me money." "What am I supposed to do with it? He plays games with us." No answer from the others, the solid practical beings who would not speak against the mysterious benefactor. Things were going too well, and in the lengthening silence I felt the depth of Nicky's anguish. I knew it, as if I were peering into his skull. And I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear delving into his soul without his knowing it. Yet I couldn't stop myself from sensing a vast secret terrain inside him. Grimmer perhaps than I had ever dreamed, and his words came back to me, that the darkness in him was like the darkness I'd seen at the inn, and that he tried to conceal it from me. I could almost see it, this terrain, and in a real way, it was beyond his mind, as if his mind were merely a portal to a chaos stretching out from the borders of all we know. Too frightening that. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to feel what he felt. But what could I do for him? That was the important thing. What could I do to stop this torment once and for all? Yet I wanted so to touch him, his hands, his arms, his face. I wanted to feel his flesh with these new immortal fingers. And I found myself whispering the word alive. "Yes, you are alive, and that means you can die, and everything I see when I look at you is utterly insubstantial. It is a commingling of tiny movements and indefinable colors, as if you haven't a body at all, but are a collection of heat and light. You are light itself, and what am I now? Eternal as I am, I curl like a cinder in that blaze, but the atmosphere of the room had changed. Luchina and Jeannette were taking their leave with polite words. He was ignoring them. He had turned to the window and he was rising as if he'd been called by a secret voice. The look on his face was indescribable. He knew I was there. Instantly, I shot up the slippery wall to the roof, but I could still hear him below. I looked down and I saw his naked hands on the window ledge. And through the silence I heard his panic. He'd sensed that I was there. My presence, mind you, that is what he sensed. Just as I sensed the presence in the graveyards. But how? He argued with himself. Could Lestat have been here? I was too shocked to do anything. I clung to the roof gutter, and I could feel the departure of the others, feel that he was now alone. And all I could think was, what in the name of hell is this presence that he felt? I mean, I wasn't Lestat anymore. I was this demon, this powerful and greedy vampire. And yet he felt my presence, the presence of Lestat, the young man he knew. It was a very different thing from a mortal seeing my face and blurting out my name in confusion. He had recognized in my monster self something that he knew and loved. I stopped listening to him. I merely lay on the roof, but I knew he was moving below. I knew it when he lifted the violin from its place on the pianoforte, and I knew he was again at the window. And I put my hands over my ears. Still, the sound came. It came, rising out of the instrument and cleaving the night as if it were some shining element other than air and light and matter that might climb to the very stars. He bore down on the strings and I could almost see him against my eyelids, swaying back and forth, his head bowed against the violin as if he meant to pass into the music, and then all sense of him vanished and there was only the sound, the long, vibrant notes and the chilling glissandos and the violin singing in its own tongue to make every other form of speech seem false. Yet as the song deepened, it became the very essence of despair, as if its beauty were a horrid coincidence, grotesquerie without a particle of truth. Was this what he believed, what he had always believed, when I talked on and on about goodness? Was he making the violin say it? Was he deliberately creating those long, pure, liquid notes to say that beauty meant nothing because it came from the despair inside him? And it had nothing to do with the despair finally, because the despair wasn't beautiful, and beauty then was a horrid irony? I didn't know the answer, but the sound went beyond him as it always had. It grew bigger than the despair. It fell effortlessly into a slow melody. Like water seeking its own downward mountain path, it grew richer and darker still, and there seemed something undisciplined and chastening in it, and heartbreaking and vast. I lay on my back on the roof now with my eyes on the stars, pinpoints of light mortals could not have seen, phantom clouds, and the raw, piercing sound of the violin coming slowly with exquisite tension to a close. I didn't move. I was in some silent understanding of the language. The violin spoke to me. Nicky, if we could talk again, if our conversation could only continue. Beauty wasn't the treachery he imagined it to be. Rather, it was an uncharted land where one could make 1,000 fatal errors, a wild and indifferent paradise without signposts of evil or good. In spite of all the refinements of civilization that conspired to make art, the dizzying perfection of the string quartet or the sprawling grandeur of Fragonard's canvases, beauty was savage. It was as dangerous and lawless as the earth had been eons before man had one single coherent thought in his head, or wrote codes of conduct on tablets of clay. Beauty was a savage garden. So why must it wound him that the most despairing music is full of beauty? Why must it hurt him and make him cynical and sad and untrusting, good and evil? Those are concepts man has made, and man is better, really, than the savage garden. But maybe, deep inside, Nicky had always dreamed of a harmony among all things that I had always known was impossible. Nicky had dreamed not of goodness, but of justice. But we could never discuss these things now with each other. We could never again be in the inn. Forgive me, Nicky. Good and evil exist still, as they always will, but our conversation is our forever. Yet even as I left the roof, as I stole silently away from the Ile Saint-Louis, I knew what I meant to do. I didn't admit it to myself, but I knew. The next night it was already late. When I reached the Boulevard de Temple, I'd fed well in the Ile de la Cité, and the first act at Renaud's House of Thespians was already underway.